The reason why it's so difficult to identify, really because of the wide spectrum of symptoms that it can cause, right? And this can be as mild as brain fog or anxiety, or it can be as severe as Parkinsonism, a condition which might mimic multiple sclerosis. It can be tremors, it can be neurological conditions, may manifest as neuropathy, may manifest as difficulty with motor coordination. In its most severe form, it can be loss of speech, visual disturbance, and paralysis as well. Peripheral neuropathy, fibromyalgia type pain, heart failure. This can be any kind of arrhythmia, problems with circulation, edema or fluid retention, or difficulty regulating their blood pressure. You can be deficient in a single organ. It's preposterous to assume that, testing is really accurate at all. Sometimes what present as gut conditions, whether it's small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, hypochlorhydria, so low stomach acid, gastroparesis. Now, if you don't have enough B1, the autonomic nervous system linking in with the enteric nervous system, you don't get the right communication. And right. What that means is the organs start producing less of what they're meant to produce. That means less stomach acid, that means less digestive enzymes. Right. There's no one way in which people will present if they have B1 deficiency. They can have some symptoms, they might not have other symptoms. Some of the main effects of B1, I don't think are involved in addressing a deficiency. In fact, I think many of the people who benefit are not deficient to start off with. Look, what we are doing is we are not trying to address a deficiency. In fact, what we're trying to do is stimulate enzymatic activity in areas of the body which has been inhibited by other causes. Basically, where the body loses the ability to undertake certain processes which need thiamine, massive doses can be needed to stimulate those activities.
Hi guys, this is Elliot from EO Nutrition, and you are watching a shortened version of a recent interview that I did with Arthur from Biohacking My Illness. The original interview was over 2 hours long, and if you want to listen to the whole thing, you can head over to his channel, which I've linked in the description below. Also, make sure to subscribe to this guy because he's got many more interviews lined up with some really interesting people working in the field of alternative health. Anyway, that's all for now, and I hope you enjoy.
What are the main symptoms or the common symptoms that people usually experience when they are B1 deficient?
Okay, yeah. So B1 deficiency it's probably a lot more common than is ordinarily thought to be, particularly in the Western world. There's this myth that people who eat a standard diet, which is fortified with vitamins and minerals, are generally not going to be deficient. The reason why it's so difficult to identify, really because of the wide spectrum of symptoms that it can cause, right? There's no real one symptom which can be present in this kind of issue. And this is really kind of what makes many clinicians and doctors scratch their heads when someone comes to them with certain symptoms and they're not really sure why they've got them. They've got no identifiable actual medical disease or medical condition. They would develop these strange symptoms. And again, there would be this triad. It would be the brain, central nervous system, the heart, but also the gut. And they refer to this condition as beriberi. Now you can have beriberi in the brain or peripheral nervous system. You can have beriberi in the heart, which is called wet beriberi, or you can have GI beriberi. Again, there's not actually that much research on this in the Western literature. And if there is, it's kind of skirts on the edge. Anything which pertains to brain function, this can be as mild as brain fog or anxiety, or it can be as severe as Parkinsonism or a condition which might mimic multiple sclerosis. It can be tremors, it can be neurological conditions, may manifest as neuropathy, may manifest as difficulty with motor coordination. In its most severe form, it can be loss of speech, visual disturbance, and paralysis as well. Peripheral neuropathy, fibromyalgia type pain. So that can be burning, that can be numbness, that can be paresthesia. The second organ is going to be the heart and the circulatory system. And so this can be heart failure. This can be any kind of arrhythmia. When the heartbeat is when it flutters, when there's murmurs, when there's anything like that, when there's problems with circulation. So it can relate to if someone has edema or fluid retention or difficulty regulating their blood pressure. And then what we also going to oftentimes see is digestive issues. And I think that this is probably the least acknowledged even in the medical community.
In your work and in your guide, you suggest that B1 can be highly, highly important for some gastrointestinal conditions like low HCl, GERD, this motility.
What I've honestly found is that sometimes what present as gut conditions, whether it's small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, hyperchlorhydria, so low stomach acid, gastroparesis, basically any condition which involves poor motility or poor communication, poor production of the digestive organs. Now, if you don't have enough B1, the autonomic nervous system linking in with the enteric nervous system, you don't get the right communication. And what that means is the organs start producing less of what they're meant to produce. That means less stomach acid. That means less digestive enzymes. Right. There's no one way in which people will present if they have B1 deficiency. They can have some symptoms. They might not have other symptoms. In fact, the motility might be too fast. They might have chronic diarrhea. Okay. And it's like, well, I've had people who have had severe diarrhea, and only when they take B1 in high doses do they actually start getting full bowel movements. Now, how on earth can we explain that? You've got the vagus nerve, which is responsible for essentially turning down inflammation. So you've got lots of inflammatory triggers going on in the gut. But if your vagus nerve is functioning properly, it can modulate the inflammatory response. So you don't have chronic gut inflammation to things that you shouldn't necessarily be reacting to. In people who have B1 deficiency, what can end up happening is they lose vagal tone. The vagus nerve does not work as it's meant to work, and therefore they end up with this chronic inflammatory kind of event, which is occurring in the gut.
I can tell you what, I tried to heal my leaky gut back in the day, and I used every single supplement under the sun for a leaky gut, and it didn't work. And I was puzzled why this doesn't work. Like, a lot of people are doing much less than I do and having much better results. And then I learned about the vagus nerve. If you are in a sympathetic tone all the time, you cannot heal your gut, period.
You know, vagus nerve is essentially, it's like an on and off switch. It's like having a direct modulating or controlling effect on the entire enteric nervous system. And it's actually that nervous system which decides whether your gut is meant to be permeable or non-permeable. Sometimes gut permeability is actually useful in certain contexts, right? That's what I think is probably the case. If we have it there, it's there for a reason, right? So ultimately, you should be able to control your gut permeability. And I think this is one of the reasons why people are so absolutely unsuccessful when it comes to healing leaky gut. If they use leaky gut protocols, if they're not getting to the root cause of why it's leaky in the first place. And that's what I think is the key point, is that in some people it's leaky because they cannot control their enteric nervous system, because they've got autonomic nervous system dysfunction. So they develop food sensitivities, gut inflammation, chronic IBS, dysbiosis. If you don't have good autonomic nervous system control, then you can't control your gut. I think a lot of the times, the people who go through these consistent gut focused protocols and killing protocols, whilst I think they certainly have their role and they deserve their spot.
But they're missing the point, right?
They miss the point, and I think it's basically beating up a dead horse. Yeah, exactly. It's like if it didn't work a couple of times, chances are it's not going to work. And I think that's why they find the information so useful, is because they've failed for so long, because they've been led down this path to believe that everything begins in the gut, and if you fix the gut bacteria, then all of a sudden everything else will get better. And in fact, whilst that does seem to be the case in some people, it seems as though taking a top-down approach and looking at the mechanism of control of the gut, which is what I like to focus on.
Yes.
It seems as though for some people that works. That is what their missing link was. Someone doesn't necessarily need to be deficient to get the prokinetic effects from different forms. The best form to stimulate motility is going to be TTFD. The research doesn't support it for thiamine, HCl, and benfotiamine. Now, here's the thing: if someone's
you mean that the research doesn't support, for instance, benfotiamine at all as far as the prokinetic?
If someone's deficient, any form of thiamine, like if their gut issues are caused by an actual deficiency or dependence on thiamine, right, then any form should ordinarily address that. However, a lot of the times it doesn't. Some people respond well to benfotiamine. Most people get the benefit from TTFD, right? In terms of the gut. Now, that's because TTFD has an interesting property. that even if someone's not deficient, if the gut cells are blocked, so for instance, if the motility reflex is inhibited by a toxin or anything else, TTFD can counteract that.
Right.
So it has a cholinergic effect. So I would say for the gut, TTFD is going to be better, although some people benefit from benfotiamine. Ultimately, yeah, it's acting on the colonic nervous. So the enteric nervous system, it's stimulating the production of acetylcholine, and it's the cholinergic action which stimulates contraction of the intestine. It doesn't work on the smooth muscle cells. It works directly on the neuron.
So is this actually known that B1 is directly influencing vagal tone, like the efficiency of the vagus nerve?
Yeah, so it's highly, highly likely. There's some Chinese and Japanese literature, which that's the only conclusion that they can come to. I mean, in the Chinese literature, you've got cases of treating infantile diarrhea, infantile gastrointestinal paralysis, and using very high amounts of B1 on a consistent basis in hundreds of infants, right? Hundreds of infants. Their conclusion was that the only way in which this is likely going to be working is by when someone is low in B1, you get issues with an enzyme called acetylcholinesterase, right? And that breaks down acetylcholine, meaning that acetylcholine is not working as it should do, essentially. And so what you end up seeing is that in a lot of the research, using B1 tends to affect systems which are innervated by the vagus nerve, and there's good theoretical justification for why that works. I'm almost
seems very logical.
Absolutely certain that it's improving vagal tone because the vagus nerve is using a neurotransmitter called acetylcholine. That's the primary neurotransmitter. To make acetylcholine, you need enough thiamine. To prevent acetylcholine from being broken down, you need enough thiamine. And here's another thing is that there's some very interesting research which would suggest that acetylcholine can't be released from the neuron and act on the other neuron without B1. Okay. So this is like a non-coenzyme effect. You've got B1, its effect on enzymes, but you've also got non-coenzyme effects. So it seems to be working primarily through addressing vagal nerve problems, but probably also on site as well in the various organs.
Got it. So someone who is stuck in fight or flight, for instance, someone who is unable to deal with high amounts of stress, would in theory B1 be useful for this matter? Or if you prefer, have you seen anybody using B1 to this end and actually have good results?
Yeah, so here's the thing, right? B1 is not only the kind of thing that you would take to address a deficiency, and this is the important point, and this is especially important in chronic illness, but also for people who don't have chronic illness and you just want to feel a bit better. Ultimately, some of the main effects of B1, I don't think are involved in addressing a deficiency. In fact, I think many of the people who benefit are not deficient to start off with. That's a bit of a controversial term, but really the people who use it in high doses, I think it's preposterous to assume that they're deficient if they're on a very good diet. They've been on a very good diet for a long time, and actually they've been taking the RDA, which is 1 milligram or whatever, and the multivitamin for several years, yet they still get marvelous results. So what we're dealing with here is we're using B1 essentially as a drug or as an ergogenic support, right? And in that case, you look at the effect that B1 can have even on a non-deficient brain. Well, it can stimulate the production of dopamine, for instance. It stimulates the production of serotonin. If someone is stuck in chronic fight or flight response, I've had many people who don't have any established health condition who say that, they might have just had a bit of difficulty getting to sleep at nighttime, or they feel as though they have poor tolerance for stress. Well, B1 in conjunction with probably a couple of other nutrients can be used and kind of like a medicine, using it in a medicinal fashion to counteract some kind of an imbalance elsewhere. You can be deficient in a single organ. You can have enough in the body, but you can have a deficiency in a single organ, which is causing us the health problem. Right. This has been known for the heart. You can have a functional B1 deficiency in the heart and not have a systemic deficiency. Same in the brain. Same, Parkinson's disease, excellent example of completely dysregulated thiamine metabolism only in certain regions of the brain. purely normal labs in every other respect.
Right.
So really, like, unless you're going to get a biopsy in your brain or something, I mean, it's preposterous to assume that, testing is really accurate at all.
So I've seen from your work and the guide that you have, and we will talk more about it later on, that you think that people with a variety of chronic health conditions may benefit from megadosing B1.
What I've found is that very high doses can be enormously effective for a wide variety of different things. Now, the question is, why does this happen? If we look at some of the conditions which respond to B1, one of those being Parkinson's, what they found is that, like we were talking about, this region of functional deficiency in the organ, in certain regions or certain cells in the brain, for instance, you end up with various kind of toxins, particularly in Parkinson's. You have these neurotoxins which have been associated with the disease. But you also have lots of other toxins. Well, these tend to have an effect on how the cells make energy. What they do is they can either bind onto enzymes. For those who aren't familiar, the way that we're basically generating energy in the form of ATP is we're taking, substrate, fat, glucose, and we're running that through various kind of cycles, Krebs cycle, electron transport chain, etc. And basically this involves lots of different enzymes. You convert one thing into another thing, into another thing, into another thing. Now, to make energy, you need all of those processes working as they should do. Now, unfortunately, what you find is that, like I was saying before, these toxins, what they do is they inhibit those enzymes. All of these enzymes need nutritional cofactors to work properly. You need iron, you need CoQ10, you need B3, B2. Now, here's where it really, really gets interesting, is that you have certain enzymes which are called rate limiting enzymes. What that basically means is that when they slow down, every other step behind them or in front of them also slows down. So you've got one called alpha-ketoglutarate dehydrogenase. You've got another one called pyruvate dehydrogenase. Both of these are really critical rate limiting enzymes. That means that if they shut down, if they slow down, then all of the other processes also shut down. And actually the cell can't generate energy. Now, if you look at what the cell, like to remain healthy, a cell needs energy. And when a cell doesn't have energy, it gets sick or it gets damaged. Both of them are dependent on thiamine. But when you inhibit pyruvate dehydrogenase, you ain't going to be burning glucose. You can't burn glucose. Yeah. You end up recycling it via lactate. So there are genetic conditions of people who have defects in making these enzymes. And the only way in which those people survive is by giving mega doses of B1. Now, the concept is that when an enzyme is either genetically determined to be poor at binding with thiamine, or alternatively, you've got something which is inhibiting that enzyme, is blocking that enzyme, they've got this problem where they've got enough thiamine coming in their diet. But the problem is that it's the enzymes are gummed up, the enzymes are blocked. What can you do about that? You can use what has been used in conventional medicine for the genetic conditions, stimulating those enzymes with mega doses. You can bypass that inhibition.
As B1 is going to stimulate the enzyme so much that there's a tipping point where even the underlying toxicity and the damage, the quote unquote damage that the toxin is creating, B1 is going to surpass that by overly activating the enzyme. Is that what you think that happens?
That's what I think the evidence suggests. Look, what we are doing is we are not trying to address a deficiency. In fact, what we're trying to do is stimulate enzymatic activity in areas of the body which has been like inhibited by other causes. Basically, where the body loses the ability to undertake certain processes which need thiamine, massive doses can be needed to stimulate those activities. Okay. Now, this is what Lonsdale said all along.
So would it be safe to just test B1 supplementation and see what happens and slowly titrate up until a point where we say that, unless we have symptoms before that, of course, but assuming that we don't have the symptoms until we hit a so-called megadose, would this be safe in order to essentially determine whether we can benefit from B1's supplementation or not?
Yeah, that's generally the only way that you can probably do it. That's the only way. Right. And that's, been a kind of hard realization for myself to come to over the past couple of years, that there is no hard and fast way to test for this. Even if you're very analytically or methodically minded and you like to have test results, it just is not sufficient. The best way is to try B1. And ultimately, since B1, unlike many of the other B vitamins or some of the other B vitamins, which do have quite valid kind of concerns when they're taken in excess, similar to minerals, thiamine is fortunately one of the things that the body is really quite good at processing excess amounts of. Now, that's not to say that someone can't get unwanted symptoms if they take a very large dose, but generally it's considered non-toxic.
So what about complex chronic conditions like we were talking about? Could conditions like mold illness and Lyme be sometimes confused with B1 deficiency or functional deficiency? Or do you think that sometimes giving high doses of B1 to patients of Lyme disease and mold illness would actually have a positive impact, not because there's this deficiency, but because of this concept that we were talking about, that B1 sometimes overly stimulates some of the enzymes that eventually mask the symptoms, if you will?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think it works both ways, and I've seen it work both ways. There is a lot of overlap in terms of symptomatic presentation. Okay, so some people can read the videos and stuff that I do. They look at the articles and they see the signs and symptoms, and actually they see that they've got autonomic nervous system dysfunction and whatnot. They think they've got a thiamine problem. Actually, it turned out that they had mold Lyme. They look very similar in terms of their symptoms, and that's kind of, really confusing sometimes for some people. You seem to have two camps, right? For some people, it tends to be the case that they respond beautifully to Lyme, to thiamine treatment, along with some other kind of anti-neuroinflammatories and things, even if they have ongoing Lyme, but also if they have a mold problem, because sometimes I think that if you look at the neuroinflammatory processes that are caused by mold or Lyme, then ultimately it's producing the same chemicals which have this effect on metabolism. In a mold patient, what they can see is that whilst you've got these inflammatory genes which are being expressed, and they've got this neuroinflammation, what there also is present of is hypometabolism in the brain. So you've got this inability or this defect in making energy. Now, the question is this purely a cell danger response whereby it's suitable or it's preferential not to make energy? Does it benefit them? Or alternatively, is it a downstream detrimental side effect that they get from chronic neuroinflammation, and actually does fixing the energy problem help them deal with the inflammatory problem? Some people, it seems as though if they've treated Lyme, if they've got out of a moldy environment, but if they've still got this kind of chronic neuroinflammation and autonomic nervous system dysfunction, then for them, sometimes it is a case of actually stimulating metabolism, starting to open up those energy generating pathways. And so the brain can actually start clearing the waste. And in some people, they recover from what they thought was post-Lyme syndrome. It was actually like a collection of nutritional deficiencies which were induced by chronic infection, even though they dealt with chronic infection. Although some people get the impression that, I think everyone should take mega doses of B1, that I categorically don't. I think that they should trial it out, because I don't think that there's many risks involved, long-term genuine risks. What I would say, though, is that I have many people with SIRS or with Lyme or with mold or, kind of a collection of those kind of conditions, who take anything which stimulates energy metabolism, they get worse. Right. And I think that this does potentially relate to Navio's theory of the cell danger response, and that if the cells are stuck in this like battleship mode, then when you stimulate anything you take, which is designed to kind of stimulate the process of oxidative phosphorylation, it ends up just generating. Exactly. This is especially true if someone's got defective mitochondria as well, right? Exactly. For people who are damaged by drugs, for instance, right? You've got someone who has ciprofloxacin reaction, fluoroquinolones, right? It could be even metronidazole, any of these drugs which cause, widespread mitochondrial damage. What I would say is, if you stimulate damaged mitochondria, what is potentially going to happen is they're going to spew out a bunch of reactive oxygen species. You're going to get massive amounts of oxidative stress, and you're going to feel terrible.
Elliot devised a guide, a so-called guide that he has on his website. I've looked through it. I've studied it. It is magnificent information. And Elliot, in that document, also describes the paradoxical reaction to B1, which briefly, if I got it right, you may be deficient in B1, you take B1, but actually the symptoms get a little bit worse before they get better.
Any new odd symptoms or worsening of any current symptoms, any symptom can be really part of the paradoxical effect. And I'd just like to also kind of articulate that it's a theory. What I've laid out is a theory for why the paradoxical effect happens. Like no one really knows. Lonsdale believes it's a shift from catabolic physiology to anabolic physiology. What I would say is that clinically, you can oftentimes mitigate, or you can reduce the amount of effects that someone has using other nutrients. And what that suggests to me really is that it does involve some kind of an increased requirement or some kind of an imbalance that is occurring with the other associated nutrients. Two of the key things are going to be magnesium. And I have personally found is potassium is massive. When they're taking high B1, they move, they start building stuff up. They're becoming more anabolic, let's say. I think what's happening is they're using up a lot of their raw material and increasing the requirement for it. That's one thing. Also, another thing is that when you have these cycles, again, when you're making energy, you think of it like cogs, wheels, right. Multiple different cogs. When you start driving or spinning one, you need to spin the others. And that means that you've got an increased requirement for lots of different things downstream. So it's really difficult to kind of isolate those things without, Absolutely. Doing testing and things. But overall, the paradoxical effect, it tends to be the case that even if it's very mild, people usually do get worse before they get better. One other thing that you did mention before, which also can happen, is they can get better before they can get better, and then they get worse, and then they get better, and then they get worse. There's really no rhyme or reason to it. There's a lot of nutritional interactions that I think need to be taken into consideration before someone starts this kind of a thing. And taking a mega dose of B1, really high dose, all of a sudden, without doing your homework, is really not a good idea. It's really not a good idea. And I learned the hard way. And unfortunately, some of my clients also learned the hard way in the early days, because I would just kind of, be gung ho and say, oh yeah, take this, take that. And it made a lot of people worse, and they couldn't deal with the paradoxical effect of it all. Now I take a much more conservative approach and go very slowly. As you see on the document, I recommend going super slow and hitting all of the bases as well. And I often find when you do that, actually someone can tolerate the nutrient, and they can actually benefit marvelously. The only reason why I favor TTFD, it seems as though in people who don't respond to any other form, TTFD can be the only one that helps them. That's not necessarily true for thiamine HCl, although I think it can be. In some people, it's just less common. Benfotiamine it's very good. I really like it. I think it's excellent. And in people who can't tolerate TTFD, by all means, benfotiamine is the next best thing. Yeah. It's the go-to, right? Without a doubt. And in fact, people who are very sensitive, they don't take TTFD. I'm more than happy for them
straight to benfo.
To take benfo. But if someone has come to me and they've only tried benfo and they've still got issues with their gut and things like that, then I will put them on TTFD, and it will usually work. Yeah. So that's why that's the only reason why I created TTFD, or why I started manufacturing it, was because there was no other form without any fillers, because people who are sensitive to foods generally, they also have sensitivity to other like supplement fillers.
Absolutely. So let's just assume that someone is B1 deficient. What is the best time of the day, if you're aware of that, if there is one, to supplement with thiamine?
So again, that's context dependent. And the reason I say that is because some people, it would depend on the kind of effects that they get. So if someone takes B1 and it gives them lots of energy, it makes them feel as though they don't have fatigue, but it also is quite stimulating for them, then that's going to be potentially a big problem if they take it at nighttime, because really one of the key kind of side effects of taking too much thiamine, or taking thiamine at all at different times of day, is insomnia. Right? For some people, it gives them so much energy that they can't go to sleep. So for those people, I would say, well, you need to take thiamine in the morning time. And that's what most people find, in my opinion. That said, for someone who already has insomnia and someone who might have a variety of other kind of symptoms, for them, actually taking thiamine later in the day can have the opposite effect to actually allow someone to start sleeping properly. If someone is using high doses, generally what I find is that if they take all of their B1 in the morning, for instance, then they might get to a point midday or later, earlier on in the afternoon, mid to late afternoon even, where they hit a crash and some of their symptoms start coming back. And in fact, sometimes the symptoms get worse. So for instance, someone might have severe anxiety, or they might have like a major energy crash, or they might get insomnia for some reason. And in that kind of situation, what Chandler Mars was actually the one who kind of put me onto this, and I tried it in several people and it seems to work very well, is what ends up happening is that they give themselves a big bolus of thiamine, and that kind of temporarily restores some function to their system. But then because of thiamine's kind of relatively short half-life and its ability to be excreted from the body relatively quickly, then what ends up happening is that they get to a point where their blood thiamine levels drop.
Right.
They need a booster. So for these people, sometimes it works to have thiamine every 2 hours. And I also have a guide, which we alluded to earlier on, and that's something that I made for people who come across my work, who want a consultation, but who I can't see at the moment. I'm not seeing anyone. So that is really for people who think they have a problem with thiamine processing. They think they have a thiamine responsive condition or a deficiency. They want to know how much to take, how much to start with. What condition they have is going to depend on what they need to take or what they might benefit from taking, and kind of how to navigate that whole process. Also how to test, if they want to do some testing for other nutrients, how to interpret some basic markers on an organic acids test, for instance, how to interpret some basic markers on a blood count, on a comprehensive blood count, and what symptoms they might want to look at if they think that they're throwing out another nutrient. What I often see. Now, none of this is medical advice. It's ultimately just my experience and what I found. And it's generally got some pretty good feedback. So that's what really that's designed to do. And that can be found on my website as well.
Awesome. So I'll also leave the description to your, the link to your website in the description down below. Elliot, it was a true pleasure to be talking to you today. We took probably more than 2.5 hours. So this was quite of a stretch. I thank you so very much for your time and being here. And hopefully, who knows, in the future, I'll bring you once again to talk about oxalates. I would like to discuss that, since I didn't have the perfect timing to throw some oxalate questions into the game. But again, thank you so very much for being here.
Thank you for having me. I do appreciate it. And keep on with the good podcasts.
Absolutely. Will do. Thanks.